All right, it is 1:30, and if a few more people keep joining us, that's great. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Candace Summers. I'm the Director of Education at the McLean County Museum of History. Kind of a nice dreary day that we can have a nice inside activity to do. And I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to today's webinar. We could not have programs like today's without support from the community, our members, and people like you. So if you enjoy today's program and want to help the museum continue to host quality educational programs like this one, please consider becoming a member if you're not already, or making a donation by following the link that I'll drop in the chat box here in a little bit. And I would also like to thank Illinois Humanities for their support of today's program as well. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to go over the format for today's program. We will be recording today's program so that people who could not join us can watch it later. We will also have questions at the end of today's program. So if you want to ask a question, if you hover your mouse over the bottom, there's a box that pops up and it's called the Q&A. You can drop your questions in there, or you can drop them in the chat box, and then I will ask them to our speaker at the end of today's program. If you're having a technical issue, say with sound, please drop a comment in the chat box and we'll see if we can help you fix that issue. And with that, I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Susan Lindsey, who will present the program on her new book, Liberty Brought Us Here, The True Story of American Slaves Who Migrated to Liberia. Ms. Lindsey earned her bachelor's degree in communication from Pacific Lutheran University in Washington State before starting a nearly 20-year career in corporate communication and public relations. 10 years ago, she launched Savvy Communications, an editing business. She is co-author and editor of Speed Family Heritage Recipes, a historical cookbook of recipes from the Speed family who built Farmington Plantation in Louisville. Lindsey has also published several essays and short stories. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Susan Lindsey.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes,
all right.
Perfect.
Just making sure. Thank you very much, Candace, for that nice introduction. And I want to thank the museum for hosting this. I'm really pleased that so many people have joined, and thank you all for spending some time today to hear this story. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the story of the story, how I came to write this book. So first of all, let me give you a little bit of background about what the story is. Liberty Brought Us Here is about two families of enslaved people from Christian County, Kentucky. That's southwestern Kentucky, just above the Tennessee line. And these two families were freed and then migrated to Liberia, Africa in 1836. The book is also the parallel story of the man who freed some of them, a man named Ben Major, and his new life after he left Kentucky and moved to central Illinois. So the story clearly involves slavery, which was the most divisive issue in American history, the hotly debated colonization movement, and the early history of a small African country, Liberia. So a little bit of background on me. I was born in Washington State, lived there much of my life, but I had ancestors who had lived in Kentucky, who had lived in Christian County, Kentucky. So I moved to Kentucky in the year 2000, and my brother, who was very much interested in family history, asked me to do some research while I was here. And it was while doing that research that I came across the story of Ben Major. Ben was a close friend and neighbor of my great-great-great-grandfather, a man named James Alfred Lindsey. Now, these two men had a lot in common. They both lived in the same county. This is a picture of Ben Major. I think he's a good-looking guy. They both lived in Christian County, and at that time, in the early 1830s, the population of Christian County was 46% Black. Most of those people were enslaved. The percentage of free Blacks in that county was very, very small. And the reason there were so many slaves in that area was that it was primarily large tobacco and hemp plantations. Both Ben and my ancestor were early and active members of a church called the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. This was an American denomination. It was founded by two men, Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. And it turns out that both my ancestor and Ben knew Alexander Campbell. These men were both slave owners, and yet they both gave up slavery and ended up moving from Kentucky to central Illinois in the early 1830s. Now, my ancestor moved to Mackinaw. Many of you may be familiar with that. And if you know where the Mackinaw Valley Vineyard is, that was his land. Ben ended up moving to a town called Walnut Grove, which was later renamed Eureka College. And in fact, Ben Majors, the town was renamed Eureka, and Ben ended up founding Eureka College. So he has deep ties to the area of central Kentucky. Two of his brothers also moved there. He had a brother named Chastine who moved to Danville Township, and his older brother, William T. Major, moved to Bloomington and was a prominent pioneer in Bloomington, and was a founder of the Christian church there in Bloomington, and he's buried in Evergreen Cemetery. So there's all these different connections to central Illinois. This story starts in Kentucky, goes to Illinois, and of course also ends up being in Africa. So I read just a couple of lines about Ben, just a single paragraph that said he had freed his enslaved people and they migrated to Liberia, and that then they wrote letters back and forth. And I was really intrigued by this. I wanted to know more. And so the people that he freed, I discovered, were two brothers. Their names were Tolbert and Austin Major. Like many enslaved people, they used the surname of their owner. Both of them had children. Austin had 3 little children, and Tolbert had 2. Ben also owned 2 teenage girls. And those girls, their mother lived on a neighboring plantation. She was enslaved there. And she also had 5 sons. Her name was Agnes Harlan. So it was these 2 families, the Majors and the Harlans, who end up going to Liberia. Now, they weren't alone in seeking new lives there. There was a group called the American Colonization Society. It was founded in 1816. And it was the national organization that represented what had come to be known as the Colonization Movement. This was the idea that free-born and freed Black people could go live somewhere else. This was not a new idea by the 1830s. It had been debated for decades. It had been talked about in houses of worship, both houses of Congress. There was a lot of debate about it, a lot of discussion of where exactly people could go and how that would all be carried out. It started, as I said, in 1816. It lasted until 1913. Over those 93 years, 16,000 Black people left the United States, left the racism, the violence, the oppression here to have new lives in Liberia, Africa. This was, as far as I can tell, the largest outmigration in U.S. history. And yet it's a topic very few Americans know anything about. So if I could have the next image, this is an image of a receipt. Now, when Ben left Kentucky to come to Illinois, he could not bring enslaved people with him. Illinois was a free state. But he wanted to free them so that they could go to Liberia. But the Colonization Society, it was never a government agency. It was a private organization funded by dues and subscriptions and donations. They didn't own a fleet of ships. They couldn't schedule a ship every month or every 2 weeks or whatever. So what they had to do was wait until they had a list of people, enough people who were interested in going to Liberia. Then they would charter a boat and they would hire a crew, and then they would send agents around the South and around other places to gather these people and bring them to the departure point. So Ben couldn't bring them with him to Illinois. He ended up leaving his enslaved people with his brother Joseph, who stayed in Kentucky. Then, when the colonization agent came to Christian County, Kentucky, Joseph turned them over to him. So this receipt says, received of Joseph Major, the immigrants of Benjamin Major and Chastine Major in number 11, also $115 for the use of said immigrants. This is literally a receipt for human beings. This piece of paper still exists. It is in the possession of Ben Major's descendants. They've been kind enough to let me hold it, which was chilling to think that I was holding a piece of paper that was a receipt for people. So Tolbert, Austin, and Agnes all end up in the care of this colonization agent who comes through southwestern Kentucky. He ends up bringing other newly freed people from Kentucky and from northern Tennessee. They are escorted by this agent. They go by boat up the Cumberland River to the Ohio River, then to Pittsburgh, and finally on to Staten Island, New York. Now, once they reached Staten Island, once they reached New York, they were housed at a quarantine center on Staten Island. And this was because they were waiting for everybody, for all the different people who had expressed an interest in going, for all of them to gather, to get there before they could leave. That was one reason. I suspect there was another reason, although I've not found documentation for this, but I think that they wanted to make sure everybody was healthy before they boarded that ship. There's no indication that any of them were ill, but it would have been a catastrophe to have a disease outbreak aboard a ship. And the American Colonization Society had that happen at one point when there was an outbreak of cholera on one of their ships, and several people died, and the ship had to turn around and come back to America. So they ended up leaving from this Staten Island quarantine center on a ship called the Luna. And they left the very day after Independence Day, which I think is poetic justice. They left on July 5th, 1836. So I want to read to you a passage from the book. This is from the start of chapter 6. And in this passage, I talk about crewmen, and that's spelled K-R-U. The Crew were one of the indigenous groups that lived in Liberia at the time. Chapter 6. We have all landed on the shores of Africa. Austin Major stood at the bow of the Luna and stared at the horizon, impatient to see land again. They had been at sea for more than 6 weeks, and the novelty and excitement of the voyage had worn off long ago. His children, Mary, Carolyn, and Thomas, were weary of being confined aboard a vessel, and the adults were more than ready to begin their new lives. It was August 19th, and here, so close to the equator, the sun blazed hot and glared off the waves. "Land," a sailor shouted, "land ahead." Austin gazed intently and saw a hazy bump in the distance. Passengers scrambled to the rail, pointing and chattering. The bump became larger and clearer until the passengers glimpsed the lush beauty of Cape Mescherado, the site of Monrovia, Liberia. The rocky brush-covered cliff towered 80 feet straight up from the pounding surf. Several hundred feet from the base of the cliff, Captain Hallett commanded the crew to drop anchor. Austin saw no wharf. He glanced down at the surface of the water 15 or 20 feet below and wondered how on earth they would get to shore. He spotted a group of African men launching a large dugout canoe from a small beach under the cape. The men were powerfully built and naked except for loincloths. As they neared the ship, Austin saw that each man had a blue line tattooed from his forehead to the tip of his nose. Some of them bore additional tattoos on their cheeks. Reverend Herring had told him about the distinctive marks worn by the men of the crew tribe. Austin had never seen such tattoos, and a shiver traced his spine. The Luna's crew dropped a rope ladder to the nearest canoe. Ignoring the doubts that nibbled at the edge of his consciousness, Austin clambered down and stepped into the canoe with the barely clothed strangers. The ship rocked, the ladder swayed. He glanced up at Tolbert, who handed down Austin's children and then his own sons. Agnes's oldest boy, Louis, descended into another canoe and helped his younger brothers, Asbury, Wesley, Coke, and Fletcher, down the rope ladder. The skirts worn by the women and older girls made descent on the ladder dangerous, but Captain Hallett had an ingenious solution. The crew brought a chair topside, and one at a time they tied each woman and girl into the seat, then used a hook and tackle to hoist the chair over the rail. Each female dangled for a heart-stopping moment above the waves before being lowered to the waiting canoes. The crewmen paddled for shore, but stopped short of the beach. One of them leaped into chest-deep water and steadied the boat. Another crewman, tall and strong, slipped into the water, then extended his arms toward Mary, Austin's 5-year-old. Before Austin could stop her, Mary smiled and slid into the African's arms. She traced her fingers over the blue lines on his face as he carried her to the beach. Several men and women dressed in clothing more familiar to the passengers had gathered on shore. One woman took Mary's hand and greeted her in English. The crewman waded back to the canoe. Tolbert, Austin, and Louis stepped into the water too and carried the other children ashore one by one. Austin helped Agnes, and Louis piggybacked his sisters to shore. Austin breathed deeply of Africa. The heavy scent of unfamiliar flowers, dried fish, wood fires, and salt water mingled in the steamy air. He ran his hands through his hair, stiff with sea salt. Monrovia wasn't their final destination. The captain was delivering mail and cargo, and the crew would take on fresh water and supplies before heading down the coast to Bassett Cove. All of their belongings remained on board, but the captain had encouraged them to explore Monrovia. Mary ran to join Austin, and he swung her up on his shoulders. Carolyn and Thomas made their way through the loose sand to their father's side. Some of the Monrovian men directed them toward a trail. The Majors and Harlans, the Buckners, the Haynes family, the Herrings, and other Luna passengers made their way up a half-mile path from the beach, winding up the stony trail to the cliff-top town. Austin felt his calf and thigh muscles tighten as he climbed the hill. It felt good to stretch his legs. They reached the top, and the settlement spread out before them. Austin saw wide, grassy streets and at least 2 churches. Houses and businesses were built of wood and stone. Some were utilitarian and little more than shacks. Others were wood frame houses, as handsome as anything he'd seen in Kentucky, painted white with neat green shutters and surrounded by tidy vegetable gardens. Mary struggled to get off his shoulders. He set her down, and she ran ahead to catch up with her brother, sister, and cousins. Austin glanced back at the sea below. The Luna and several other ships flying foreign flags waited at anchor. He took one more look at the wide expanse of ocean stretching forever back to America, and then joined his family. So obviously that's when they arrive in Liberia. Now, they did not stay in Monrovia. They went down the coast a little further to a place called Bassett Cove. So what were my motives in writing this book? My first was just pure curiosity. I wondered why Ben Major, who I discovered was descended from a long line of slave owners, why did he decide to free them? What was it that made him make that choice? Did those newly emancipated people want to go to another country? Did they have any choice in it? What would life in Africa have been like for them? Did they survive? And what was the colonization movement about? Who were the people who supported it or opposed it, and what were their reasons? So many of the answers were found in their correspondence, in the letters that are at McLean County Museum of History. This scan is a scan from the first letter sent from Africa to Ben Major. This was written by Tolbert, Austin's brother, and it opens with, "Dear Sir, we have all landed on the shores of Africa and got into our houses. We've been here 3 weeks. None of us has been taken yet with the fever. We have a prospect of war with the natives." So this letter hints a little bit at what is ahead for these settlers. My second motive was a desire to share this story. As I was doing the research and getting excited about it, I would share with different people what I was doing, and most people seemed very interested. In all fairness, yes, some of them, their eyes glazed over and they were quickly bored and I stopped talking. But for the most part, people seem to be really interested. And I think this is because this is not a topic that's taught very often or very thoroughly in American schools. Because I make a living as a manuscript editor now, I'm in touch with a lot of people in the publishing business. And it wasn't until somebody else in the publishing industry said this might make a good book that I really started thinking about it as a book project. Up until then, I was just doing it on my own. So after that, that took on new purpose and intensity. And finally, I had a real strong motive to honor the memory of these people, Tolbert and Austin and their families, and Ben Major, who had freed them. And I wanted to bring to light, through their experiences, the story of the colonization of Liberia. So it took a lot of research. In fact, it took about 6 years of research. Now, I wasn't doing that, 40 hours a week because I work full time, but worked on the weekends and evenings and vacation days to do this kind of research. Now, I've often compared book research to doing a jigsaw puzzle. I like jigsaw puzzles. I like to assemble them. But think of a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces are scattered across several states. They're mixed in with pieces of other puzzles that have nothing to do with this puzzle. A lot of those puzzle pieces are missing, and you're never going to find them. They're not under the couch. But worst of all, there's no box lid. There's no picture of what the final puzzle is about. So you're assembling these pieces just on blind faith that you're going to find enough of them to create a picture. Because it's a nonfiction story, it was critical to get the details right. So I used multiple sources in my research. I took extensive notes. I made reams of photocopies and digital scans for later reference. And I knew that I would have to cite my sources in a nonfiction book, in footnotes or endnotes, and in a bibliography. So I had to track all of the sources and keep track of where different pieces of information came from. Now, fortunately, in this process, I had help. I was not employed by a university. I didn't have research assistants that way. This was just a project I was doing on my own. But I was talking about it with one of my cousins, Pam Robertson, and she said, "Oh, I would love to help you with that research." And so Pam became my research assistant. We jokingly referred to her as the research assistant extraordinaire. And she had an old van, I had an old Volvo station wagon, and we drove all over. We went to several states and to Washington, D.C. to piece together the research for this book. We looked at print things like academic journals, books, courthouse documents, things like marriage records, wills, land records, different family records from the Major family. I was able to track down descendants of Ben Major, and they were very generous with their records and private pieces. We also looked at old newspapers. I read more than 300 letters from other Liberian settlers. And that sounds like a lot, but when you put into place that idea of 16,000 people went to Liberia, 300 letters doesn't sound like a lot. But it did give me a broader view of what that settler experience would have been like. We also used online resources. There's a lot of great information online now. The trick is, of course, to figure out what is credible and reliable information versus just stuff that people put up there that doesn't have any basis that can be documented. Pam and I did a lot of research in universities, museums, archives. We walked through cemeteries, and we spent 2 or 3 weekends in the attic of the Major home in Eureka. As I said, the descendants of Ben Major were very generous and helpful. I also worked with people who had either lived in Liberia or had traveled there extensively, people who had written about Liberia, people who are Liberian, some of whom are still living in Liberia, and some who are now living in the United States. And then I joined an organization called the Liberian Studies Association. And in 2015, I was invited to speak at their international conference on the work that I was doing on this story. And then was invited again this year to speak at the conference. And it was, of course, canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in addition to researching the stories of Tolbert and Austin and Agnes and Van Major, I also had to research the surrounding issues. I had to understand slavery and the arguments for and against slavery, the abolition movements, the emancipation movements, the colonization movement, and Liberia's early history. Because you can't tell the story of these individuals without telling the story of what was going on around them. In particular, I really wanted to understand why people supported or opposed the colonization movement. Now, there's been a long-standing narrative when this topic is taught, which, as I said, it's not taught very often, but this notion that colonization was all about racism, that it was about kicking all the free Black people out of the United States. Now, there's some truth to that, in that there were many of the founders who had racist motives. But the whole truth is much more complex. There were other reasons as well, other motivations as well. And those included things like expanding trade from West Africa, because of course the legal importation of slaves had ended in 1808. So they were thinking, well, maybe there are other products of Africa that we can start a trade with Africa. Some of it was missionary zeal. They believed that these people who came from the United States, who many of them were Christians, that if they were planted on the shores of Africa, that they could Christianize the so-called savages. Some of it was altruistic, in that the slave trade still continued as slave ships took people to Brazil and Central America and the Caribbean, and that maybe if colonies of people who used to be enslaved themselves were on those shores, maybe they could help interrupt the slave trade. So there were all these different motivations for people supporting slavery. Those are just the main ones. There were others as well. In any research like this, there are these just exciting milestones, these eureka moments that happen. So I wanted to share a couple of those with you. The first thing that Pam and I had to do was make sure we had really good transcriptions of these letters. As you can see from this letter on this screen, these are very, very old letters. The paper's yellowed and brittled. The handwriting is cursive, and it's old-fashioned handwriting. The ink in some cases is faded. Some of the letters have physical holes in them. So someone had transcribed the letters years ago for the museum. But in many spots, that transcriber had written illegible because she could not figure out what was being said there. So the museum was kind enough to let Pam and I work with the originals, and we sat in a little reading room away from the main reading room. And one of us would read from the transcription, and the other one would follow along on the original letter, and to see that there weren't discrepancies or missing information. And we tried as best we could to try and interpret those illegible sections. We even used a magnifying glass. We went line by line, word by word, sometimes even letter by letter, to try and get the best transcriptions that we could. We quickly ran into a couple of mysteries. In the very first letter, at the bottom of the letter, this is a multi-page letter that you see on the screen, so you're only seeing the first page there. This was a longer letter. But at the very end of this letter, Tolbert is sending greetings to people that he left behind in Kentucky. And so it's this long list of say hello to so-and-so. And in the middle of this passage, the original transcriber had transcribed a sentence this way: "To God overshines my respects." This seemed like a really odd sentence. We knew that these people who went to Liberia were Christian. They talk in their letters about their faith. They talk about churches. They quote scripture. But still, "to God overshines my respects" seemed odd. It just didn't seem right. it was not until months and months and months later, I was looking at the Christian County census, and I found a man named Gideon Overshiner in the census. He lived next door to Ben Major. So the passage really said, to Gid Overshiner, my respects. So he was sending greetings to someone. The second one was, Pam and I were reading these letters in the museum reading room, and Pam came and was trying to figure out this one word that had been marked illegible. And she had the magnifying glass, and she said, this sounds crazy, but this looks like it says lobelia. Well, lobelia, as many of you know, is a plant. It's a flowering plant. And I found the answer to that. Ben Major was an advocate of something called Thompsonian medicine. This was a sort of a craze for botanical medicine that was occurring across the United States at that time. So people made remedies and treatments from different leaves and roots and berries and different parts of plants. And lobelia was one of the major plants that they used in their treatments. So that's what it said. It said lobelia. There were some deeply moving moments as well in this research. One was when we were at the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort doing research there, and we came across something with Ben Major's signature on it. Now, we knew he was a real man. We had seen images of him. We knew he was somebody who had really existed. But seeing his signature, seeing his handwriting made him real to us in a way that he just hadn't been before. Another really cool moment was one of the little bits of things I knew about colonization before I started this was I had heard that Abraham Lincoln was a supporter of colonization. So we were at the Library of Congress. Pam and I spent a week there reading microfilm. That'll do your eyes in. We were there when they opened the door in the morning, and we stayed until they kicked us out at night. And so I was looking at the membership list, the list of life members of the American Colonization Society. And I found Ben Major. I found two of his brothers. I found Daniel Webster. I found Henry Clay, Francis Scott Key. A number of prominent Americans supported the colonization movement. So this membership list was set up a little bit like an Excel sheet. It had columns with the person's name on the far left, and then year after year after year going toward the right. So I went down and I found A. Lincoln, Springfield, Illinois. And I looked over the years to the columns to the right, and way over toward the right, there was a notation that said, address change, Washington, D.C. So that confirmed not only that Lincoln was a member and interested in the colonization movement, but that he had continued to receive their publications after he became president. And then Pam and I had talked about finding the Holy Grail. We were looking for something in Ben Major's own writing that told why he made this choice. And we were looking through the family records from the Major family, and we found a draft of a letter that Ben was writing to his brother Joseph, the one who stayed in Kentucky. And in that letter, Ben talks about freeing himself and his family from the curse of slavery. He uses that word. And he talks about someone else that he feels is not perhaps doing what they ought to be doing. And it was this very passionate passage in this letter about his feelings about slavery. And so that was just an incredible moment to find.
Susan, you're muted.
All right, hang on. Better?
You're good.
Okay.
You're good.
Sorry, I must have bumped it with my sheet. Was I muted long?
No, just like 10 seconds.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So as new questions cropped up, these were things we would have to uncover as well. So by the time we were done with all of this research, we were nearing the end of the research, and we had two questions left that we were really struggling to find answers for, and we knew there was a chance we might never find the answers. One of these was we wanted to know what port they left from. So I told you earlier they left from Staten Island. We didn't know that at first. We knew that the Colonization Society sent ships from a number of different U.S. ports, from Newark, from New York, from Charleston, from New Orleans, and from other ports. Now, we suspected that they had left from either Newark or New York, but we hadn't been able to prove that. And I was in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. They have a private research library there. And one of the staff members had access to a newspaper archive that I didn't have access to. And lo and behold, she found a newspaper story that told about the send-off ceremony for the Luna, for the very ship that they were on. And it talked about the hymns that they sang and who spoke at the ceremony. It was an incredible find. So that confirmed for us that they left from New York. The other question that came up was, in my research, I'd come across two different accounts that said one of these people who went to Liberia in this group in 1836 comes back to the United States in 1858, years and years later. Someone comes back, goes to Eureka, speaks at the Eureka Christian Church, talks about living in Liberia, talks about the challenges that they faced and his hopes for the future of Liberia. And then when he's done speaking, he and Ben's family go to the cemetery, to Oleo Township Cemetery, and they visit Ben's grave, and he prays at the grave of Ben Major. Now, as I said, I found two different articles about this. Neither article named the person who came. So Pam and I were trying very hard to try and figure out who was it that came all the way from Liberia back to Eureka to pray at Ben's grave. And we'd almost given up. We didn't think we were going to find the answer to this. And Ancestry.com uploaded some new passenger lists, New York passenger lists, and Pam plugged in a name, and there it was. It popped up. Now, this person had slightly changed his name, but we knew that it was him. So then we had the date he arrived, the ship he arrived on, and even what kind of passage he had paid to board that ship. That was an incredible moment to find that. So this picture is of Ben Major's grave. He is buried in Eureka in the Oleo Township Cemetery, and his wife Lucy is buried next to him. Now, there were some surprises along the way, things that I really didn't expect to find, things that challenged some of my assumptions. Some of you may be thinking, how could these people have sent Ben Major letters? Wasn't it illegal to teach slaves to read and write? I thought that too. What I discovered through research was that was sort of one of those partial truths. It was illegal in many southern states to teach slaves to read and write. It wasn't illegal to educate them, it was only illegal to teach them to read and write. You could teach them math or science or other subjects, not that people necessarily did, but it was specifically reading and writing that was outlawed. But it was not outlawed in every southern state, and it was not illegal in Kentucky. It was highly unusual. Ben was probably, we found documentation that says that Ben taught them to read and write before he freed them. He was probably condemned for that by his neighbors, but we know that he did that, and we know that he did it legally in Kentucky. Secondly, I was surprised by how active women were in this colonization movement and in the settlement of Liberia. I think I had in my head, all of those explorers you learn about when you're in elementary school, and I had it in my head that pioneers going to a new country, that it would be primarily young men in their 20s and 30s. That was completely wrong. Almost half, 45% of the settlers were female. Many of them were single mothers or widows. And those who colonized Liberia ranged in age from newborn children to one woman who was said to be over 100. So I was really surprised, though, that so many of them were women. And while white men founded the American Colonization Society, and white men accounted for 90% of the nation's slave owners, white women slave owners were more than twice as likely to free their enslaved people for colonization. So that was surprising to me. I was saddened and surprised to learn that on average, 90% of the people who went to Liberia died of malaria in the first year that they were there, 20%. Another thing that surprised and saddened me was when I discovered that once settled in Liberia, Black Americans did what many immigrants do. They tried to recreate the place they came from. Well, for those who had been slaves, the place they came from was the American South, which was a two-tiered society with white people on top and Black people below. Those settlers from America created a two-tiered society in Liberia, with themselves on the top and indigenous people below. That aspect of the colonization movement had an enduring impact on the country of Liberia. It ultimately resulted in a coup in 1980 and two horrific civil wars that destroyed much of the country. So my conclusions. I think that Ben Major was a decent guy. I think he was a good guy. That's not typically what we think of when we think of slave owner. We don't typically equate that. And some of you may challenge me. You may think that I'm wrong. But I know for sure he was an intelligent man. He was a compassionate man. He had a strong faith. I know that he valued family. I know that he valued education. But the evidence I would cite for saying that he's a good guy is that he did not have to maintain contact with those people he freed. He could have done what many slave owners did and say goodbye, good luck, when they were no longer his property. He didn't do that. He not only continued a correspondence with them for all those years, he also bought supplies and shipped them to Liberia at his own expense. He did this multiple times. He sent them seeds and tools and medicine and cloth and books and all kinds of things. He didn't have to do that, and he chose to do that. And the letters from Tolbert and Austin and the others in Liberia indicate that they respected and cared for Ben, that they may have even loved Ben and his family. In some of the letters, they refer to him as dear father. Now, many slave owners did father mixed race children with their enslaved women. That is not the case here, and I know that because I know their ages. It was not, they were children at the same time. It was biologically impossible for Ben to have been the father of Tolbert and Austin. And finally, Ben kept those letters. He kept them all of his life, and he must have emphasized their importance to his children because they and subsequent generations also kept them. For decades, they kept these letters. I also think that Tolbert, Austin, Agnes, and the others were incredibly courageous because even though they were of African ancestry, they were not African. They were American. They'd been born and raised here. They didn't speak any of the African languages. They didn't know what crops grew there. They knew very little about the country. It's not like today when you travel somewhere, you can research it online, you can go buy books and read about it. They didn't have any of that. So they were leaving the only home they had ever known to go live in a totally foreign land. They faced an unknown future. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. And for any loved ones that they left behind, and there were people they left behind, they likely knew they would never see them again. It's not like they could zip back and forth on a plane. They were leaving them forever. But they went knowing they were going to be free, knowing that they could live in a land where they weren't looked down upon because of the color of their skin. They could offer their children a better future and their grandchildren a better future. Researching and writing this book gave me a much deeper perspective on some current issues that we talk about now in the world and in the United States. Things like systemic racism, immigration, and economic and social inequality. So what does it all mean in the end? At the beginning of the book, I quote a biblical scripture from Micah. But they shall sit every man under his own vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. That's what this story is about. It's a story of a search for peace, security, and liberty in Illinois and in Liberia. These were very real people. They lived on 2 different continents, but they all faced tough choices, grueling circumstances, disease, hardship, and multiple tragedies to build new lives. So the book's called Liberty Brought Us Here. It can be ordered through the publisher, University Press of Kentucky, and it's also available through online book retailers. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Does anyone have any questions for our speaker? Oh, there was one in the chat box. Do you, Susan, have an opinion on the contrast between the freeing of slaves in Western Europe, European monarchs, and the Emancipation Proclamation here a century later under the Democratic Republic with states' rights? That's a deep question.
I do not have an opinion, oddly enough. It's not a topic I've researched enough to be able to express an opinion on.
Well, I had a question emailed to us, so I will read it here. And I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, but could you talk a little bit about attempts to research the family's descendants in Liberia and your contacts with the Liberian diaspora in the United States?
Yes, I really tried hard to find more information about them above and beyond the letters. And I used, as I said, looked at another 300 or so letters from other Liberian settlers to get an idea of what typically would be an experience for them. But one of the challenges is that it's extremely hard to do research in Liberia. These civil wars that occurred, the National Archives were destroyed, records, great records were not kept at the beginning of the colony to begin with, and any records that were kept, you know, often were destroyed by humidity and bugs and that kind of thing. And then these wars occurred and destroyed any records that still were left. I reached out to people that I had some Liberian contacts who told me they knew some people they thought might be descendants. So I reached out to them. They said they did not have any more family information, which is entirely possible. The other thing that happened was that during these civil wars, many of the traditional storytellers, there's a real tradition of oral storytelling and oral family history records, and many of those storytellers were deliberately targeted and killed to destroy the history of Liberia. So it was really, really hard to find that information. I'm actually hoping that I hear from some descendants of the Majors and Harlans in Liberia. One thing I would like to mention here is that right now, University Press of Kentucky is offering a 25% discount if you order the book through their webpage. And if you use the code capital F, capital W, capital A, capital R, capital E, they're offering a 25% discount on the book through August 17th.
We had one more question, if you're willing to share.
Oh, okay.
Who was it who visited Ben Major's gravesite?
Wow, you want me to give away? It's a spoiler alert. Yes, I'd be willing to share that. It was one of Agnes Harlan's sons. He was a little boy when he went to Liberia. He was only 9 years old, and yet he came back to America as an adult. And by that time, he was a minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church and came to Eureka to speak about Liberia.
All right, and a couple more questions in the
Sure.
Q&A. Did you find the work of James Amenasor helpful?
Yes, he had done, I think it was a dissertation on these letters. And his information it was helpful. It helped, it was really one of the starting points for me. His work and the original transcriptions at McLean were just tremendously helpful in getting that process started.
All right, and another one, and I apologize for not naming names. The one question before was from John Muirhead. This one is from Doug Welch. Was the repatriation of free peoples from America to Liberia a positive for Native peoples?
I think the answer is mixed. There certainly was this two-tiered society, and many of the settlers from America exhibited attitudes of superiority or arrogance toward indigenous people. On the other hand, they did bring things from America that were, I think, helpful to Africa, but there were just deep simmering resentments about that divide in the society. One real positive I think that they did do was they did, in fact, help interrupt the slave trade along that coast, and they were instrumental in stopping many, many other people from the fate that they had gone through.
Right. Any other questions? These are very good questions and discussion here. Oh, one more.
Okay.
This is kind of in relationship to promoting a book. What has it been like promoting a book during a pandemic? This is a story that needs to be told, from Paula Dillman.
Yes, thank you, Paula, for that question. It has been a challenge. I had, months before the book came out, had started to book different events and author appearances and book signings and that kind of thing. And many of those have either been canceled or converted to a format like this. And I was a little distressed about that initially. And I was talking about it with a friend of mine who's also a writer. And he said, think of it this way. The advantage is that now people can attend a program like this one for McLean County Museum of History when they don't live anywhere near Bloomington. You know, they could be anywhere in the world and attend this and be involved with it. And so I think, you know, that's a real advantage. Of course, it's sad, though, to not be able to meet people in person and sign books for them and have that personal interaction with people who have either read your book or excited to read your book. You know, I think it just makes it different.
It certainly does make things different in this day and age. And just a comment from John Muirhead. He wanted to thank you for your incredible research into this topic.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, question from Jürgen Schroer. So did Ben Majors take some of his slaves with him on the first visit?
On the first visit, where?
Doesn't say where.
Ben did make a scouting trip to central Illinois before he actually moved there. And I don't know whether he took anyone with him or not. I know he went on horseback, and that was when he sort of scouted out the land that he was interested in buying. There is some apocryphal information from the family that says that there were a couple of slaves, and I can't recall their last name, who accompanied them as far as Maricopa County, is that right? Maricopa County in Illinois. But they did not come on with them to Eureka. It was illegal for anyone who was enslaved to come into Illinois at that time. Free Black people could come to Illinois, but there were Black codes that said whoever brought them had to pay a sort of a sponsorship fee of $1,000 per person to bring them into the state. So I think it's highly unlikely that Ben would have brought them with him.
Oh, he clarified did he go to Liberia with the slaves?
Oh, no, Ben did not go with them. I have no evidence that anyone from Ben's family or Ben himself ever went to Liberia. They just corresponded by letter. And that was I should say too, that was a difficult thing to do because, again, because of the humidity and the bugs in a tropical climate, paper was hard to find. And it's not like there was a drugstore nearby. I mean, they were really starting over. There were no stores. Anything they had, they either had to grow or make themselves, or occasionally supplies came by ship. So to be able to find paper and find ink in order to maintain that correspondence was a challenge. And it's something many of the settlers talked about. Please send us paper. So.
Wow, that's fascinating. One more question from Ralph Dring. What about the long-term resistance to colonization in all of Africa? Were Liberia and Ethiopia the only countries not colonized by Europe?
Yes, that is my understanding, that Liberia and Ethiopia were the only two that were not part of that great big divide up the continent that happened between Belgium and France and many other European countries. And I would like to it's a good time probably to make a distinction between colonization and colonialism. And colonialism really is stepping into a country with the notion that you're going to take over and pull all the resources out and be a ruling entity in this other land for the foreseeable future. The colonization movement, the founding documents of the American Colonization Society make it clear that from the get-go, they intended to turn over governing of that community to the settlers themselves. So this was not white America coming to Liberia to take over. This was trying to set up a colony where these people could come and lead their lives. Now, there were individuals who behaved in different ways, and like any group of people, there's good people and bad people. But generally, I don't think the intention was a bad one from the initial settlers.
Excellent. And somebody asked to repeat the website and promo code, so you can get copies of Susan's book at kentuckypress.com. And the code for the 25% discount is all capital letters, FWARE. If you are just itching to read this book and don't want to wait for your copy to come, you can also check out copies at Bloomington Public Library. They do have a few copies on hand that you can already dig right in and start reading all about it as well.
Yes, and I would like to also mention one thing that was interesting, and if the Zoom participants here decide to visit McLean Museum and see these letters, you'll notice every single inch of paper was used when they wrote letters. And there's one letter that Pam and I started calling the Origami Letter, because you had to fold the letter exactly the way it had originally been folded to read all the notes in the margins. And so they're all sort of disconnected, and when you unfold it, it looks disjointed, but when you fold it together, then you can read what it says.
And the letters are very fragile, so we tend not to get them out quite often. So I did put a link in the chat box to the finding aid to the collection that does have the updated transcriptions that Susan was so kind to update for us recently. So you can read those as well from the comfort and safety of wherever you are. And it looks like another question here. We'll make this our last one.
Can I interrupt just real quick?
Yes, please go right ahead. Yes.
So the Pam also was involved in those transcriptions, so she deserves credit as well, in the new transcriptions.
Excellent. And she pointed out in the chat that they use the copies of the letters, not the actual letters themselves. So that's a good point. We do have copies of the letters that people can look at when the museum reopens, that is.
Yes.
One final question. Would it be correct that the American colonizers had advantages that the indigenous people did not?
I'm not sure they did. I think they were at a distinct disadvantage. They didn't understand the land they had landed in. They didn't know how to grow the crops. They didn't know how to fix different foods, the way that the indigenous people did. They frequently wrote back to America asking for things like, salt pork, because they were not familiar with the animals that they could hunt and how to prepare them. They just were really, it was all so new to them, and it was all so literally foreign to them. And I do think that they did receive help from some of the indigenous people who helped them and advised them and helped them get used to things and how to do things. There were also some of the indigenous people that were extremely hostile. So there were, as I said, there were 16 different groups there. So.
All right. Well, these were excellent questions. I also dropped in the chat box that if you would like to have Susan come to a book club or a church meeting or history, genealogical society, she'd be more than happy to set something up with Zoom, and I dropped her website so you can contact her in the chat box. We hope that you enjoyed today's program. We will be loading today's program onto YouTube, the recording of it. So if you want to watch it again or share it with a friend, you can do so. And we hope that you will join us for our next program on August 8th at 1:15, featuring Phil Passon, who's going to present a musical program on women's suffrage called March of the Women. He'll be playing songs from that era on his hammered dulcimer. It'll be a Facebook Live event that we will record as well and put on our YouTube page too. And we hope you can join us for that. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day and is safe and well. And thank you once again for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.